Hey Midpoint students, I am so glad to be with you guys today. Today we are going to be walking through the life of Moses. In the book of Exodus, we follow maybe one of the greatest biblical leaders of the Bible, Moses. See, Moses was born to a Jewish family who was living in Egypt as an enslaved people. He was adopted at a young age, and he was raised by an Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter. So he was raised as royalty. Now, at this time, God's people were just really oppressed. They had lots of trauma and difficulties, enslavement. Life for a Jewish person in Egypt at the time was not a good life. They were forced to work with the Egyptians as slaves and follow the way of life that the Egyptian people followed. And although he was raised as an Egyptian, later in life, Moses discovered his family history and learned about God, and it broke Moses's heart to see his people enslaved. And so God allowed Moses to help and be the leader to free his people. We talked about that last month, how the Israelites were freed from Egyptian slavery and are now walking in truth. But even though the Israelites were free, freedom didn't happen like that. Freedom in their life didn't happen like that. Even though they were no longer living in Egypt, oppressed by the Egyptians, they still had to learn how to be free and walk in that freedom. It took them some time to fully rely on God, learning how to live in freedom and be where God took them, took time and practice and patience. And so God asked Moses to write down a list of commandments that the Israelites needed to follow. And that's found in Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17. In that chapter, God gave Moses the 10 commandments. You probably have heard of them before. They're things like, do not murder, do not commit adultery, don't steal, don't be a false witness against your neighbor, keep the Sabbath holy, don't misuse the name of the Lord. And some of the most important ones, do not put any gods in place of God. And other things were those 10 commandments. These commandments help create a guide for the Israelites people to learn how to be a true community of God. The people of Israel had to learn how to love and worship God and create a healthy community that was consistent in loving one another. And as they did, God made sure that they had everything they needed. The people of Israel were there to help the neighboring communities find God and show people what it looked like to love God, love each other, and love their families well. When there was so much confusion about what to do and how to do it, Moses helped the people of Israel focus on what God cares about, loving God and loving those around you. Have you ever had anyone in your life who helped you to see what it was like to love God and love those around you? When I was in high school, I had a wonderful mentor named Andrea. Andrea, she had grandkids, so she was a lot older than I was. But she really took the time to pour into me, to help me learn about the Bible, to help me learn about what it looked like to really love God, not just to say you loved God, but to act like you love God and to love others. We had a great group of youth and friends who did serve projects, who went out and ministered to the homeless, who went on mission trips. In fact, my very first mission trip was when I was in 8th grade here to the city of New Orleans. And God brought me back here years later, and I've lived here for 20 years now. But it was because of Andrea and my youth group that I learned how to love God and love others. Do you have people in your life that are teaching you how to love God and love others? Are you helping other people to love God and love others? So let's go back to those Israelites living in the desert, just having received the 10 Commandments. And then years pass, and years pass, and years and years and years and years and years pass. And as those years are passing, the religious leaders are doing something that as people we often do, adding more rules and adding more rules. And more rules and more rules and more rules. And as the years continue to pass, religious leaders continue to add more rules. And so they weren't God's rules. They were more ways to make worship happen in their context. But eventually people began to be judged on how they kept these laws and not really on how they kept the laws that God originally gave, the 10 Commandments. And so Jesus came, and when he arrived, he wanted people to focus again on the things that mattered most. Matthew 22:34 says, the Pharisees heard that the Sadducees, so Pharisees and Sadducees, both religious leaders, they heard that the Sadducees weren't able to answer Jesus. So the Pharisees got together. One of them was an authority on the law, so he tested Jesus with a question. He said, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment or law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Love him with all your mind," which is from Deuteronomy 6:5. This is the first and most important commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Everything that is written in the law and the prophets is based on these two commandments. So what are the most important commandments, Jesus said? Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as you love yourself. See, Jesus reminded the followers of that day how the original commandments were always supposed to remind people and point people to loving God and to loving others, because that is what matters to God. Loving God, loving others, and loving yourself is what matters to God. One of the most incredible things about God is we know that God wasn't just throwing a plan together randomly. When we look at God's story and his scripture throughout history, we see that everything is connected and has a purpose that becomes clear in Jesus' life, in his death, and then in his resurrection. It's clear how God has created a plan and a path for us to have forgiveness and reconciliation with him. We see Jesus didn't only come to fulfill the law by living a perfect life that was impossible for us to live up to. I know I can't live a perfect life, right? But to show that there's a new way to live, a way that's centered on love and in forgiveness. God always intended us to live this way. And now anyone who needed a clear example, they could do just that, because we know that great leaders choose to love.